he threw a punch and hit me fair in the right eye and knocked me to the ground. In fact, I could still feel my eye closing up.
In this episode of Exploring Violence in Society, you will hear from internationally recognised restorative justice pioneer Terry O'Connell.
The fundamental problem, however, and this is where we're seeing increasing amounts of violence, where individuals are disconnected and the process they experience doesn't allow them to learn to sit with that discomfort of the shame.
This is a show for critical and imaginative conversations about complex social issues. My name is Ben Lohmeyer and welcome to Exploring Violence and Society. So massive welcome to my guest today, Terry O'Connell. Hey Terry.
G'day Ben, how are you mate?
I'm pretty well, thank you. So we want to give a little bit of background for you, Terry, just so people know who we're talking to. So Terry is a retired director of Real Justice Australia. He's a former senior sergeant in the New South Wales Police. Terry is an internationally recognised pioneer of restorative justice and restorative practices. His work in this space has resulted in an award for the Order of Australia Medal in 1993. His work has also been profiled in documentaries such as the ABC's Facing the Demons and Australian Story. So I first met Terry, I reckon about 8 years ago, when he came to consult with a youth service I was working for at the time. He guided us through a process of integrating restorative practices into our service, and he does a lot of this kind of consulting, training, mentoring work through a range of different contexts, so working with police and teachers, and youth workers and social workers. And I thought just to get it started, Terry, I'd ask you about what's consistent across all those different contexts. You know, what's the underpinning theory or idea that guides the way that you approach questions like problems like violence with all those different groups?
Yeah, that's a simple question, but with many possibilities, Ben. It's very interesting because I guess my experience of working across so many different areas to look at the common features, the underpinning commonality across all of those areas, and no surprise that relationships loom large. And by that I mean, if you look at the evidence around what effective practice looks like, sort of regardless of the discipline or profession you're in, the evidence is pretty overwhelming that says that it's the quality of those relationships that make the greatest difference. And if I were to build on that by saying, look, a number of working assumptions that I have developed, assumptions being my beliefs, what I know to be true, what evidence supports, that act as a sort of a bit of a guide to shape my practice, is that we're relational beings. We're hardwired to experience relationships, and that we derive our identity out of those relationships. Anything that actually impedes those relationships, results in estrangement, disconnection, and the work of Brené Brown, which she talks about vulnerability, is really important in terms of understanding what happens. But vulnerability being that condition that she says either keeps us in or out of relationships. And I want to just briefly explore that because it's really the foundation on which my thinking and practice has been developed, and that is the question, what keeps us out of relationships?
Great.
And then thinking about what keeps us in relationships. And so what Brené Brown discovered when she, as a social worker working with families that were struggling, those who actually tended to manage vulnerability felt that they were worthy of loving and belonging. That's one difference between those who couldn't manage vulnerability and those who could manage it. In other words, they realised that they were far from perfect, but they were worthy of loving belonging. Now, I go back a little way before the Brené Brown sort of, whole sort of work on vulnerability by saying what triggers vulnerability. And I discovered many years ago that Sylvan Tonkin's explanation of the affect of shame, is critical to understanding vulnerability. In fact, without going into any great depth, Tompkins developed the idea that as species, we're hardwired to experience a set of innate affects. The word affect is at times interchangeable with emotion. And there's nothing we can do about it. We're hardwired to experience them. And he identified there are 9, 2 positive, one that's neutral, called surprise, startled, doesn't have a flavour, and 6 which are varying degrees of awful. The last of these to evolve, according to Tompkins, was what he called shame humiliation. And what he says that the blueprint he developed out of that sort of basic hypothesis was that our individual well-being is largely determined by our capacity to amplify, increase the positive affects, to minimise or decrease the negative affects. That anything that increased our power to ramp up the positive, downscale the negatives, was good for life. In other words, good for emotional well-being. But he said that we needed an affect that would impede our feeling good. In other words, the idea of the shame affect. And it's very interesting because when we hear the word shame, it conjures up a whole lot of negativity. But in the context of what Tompkins talks about, he says that we need something, in this case, shame. And the question I ask is, what would happen if you or I never ever got to experience shame? It's a very interesting question, because what it does, it says that we wouldn't have a moral compass. We wouldn't know what feeling good was like. We'd be sociopaths. In other words, the classic example of the old shame is, I'm one of 10 kids and my mum used to give me the look, the disapproval, and I'd go, oh, God, hell, not the look. The physiology of what would happen, is the stomach would churn, the heart rate and blood pressure would go through the roof, and I'd blush, but I'd lose muscle tone and my head would go down. And the silliest thing you could say to someone whose head goes down, and I work with lots of First Nation and Aboriginal communities where the shame job is a significant issue. The silliest thing you could say is, get your head up, look at me. So let me just link this now to this broader issue of violence.
Great.
Because it's how we've handled those emotions over the ages that tells you a story of why it is we now are seeing much more gratuitous violence. See, what Tompkins says is that shame is the affect that interrupts our feeling good. It shines a spotlight on something we don't necessarily want to know about ourselves. In other words, it brings in a critical focus, something that has happened, either we've said or done or someone else has done. Now, if I go back to my mum, the relationships are built on her capacity to actually challenge me in a way that allowed me to stop and think about something I did or said, but in a context that said, I can still love myself. I know my mum loves me, but I need to pay attention to what I've done or said, and so it becomes an opportunity for growth. and happens because, it's in a loving and supportive context. The fundamental problem, however, and this is where we're seeing increasing amounts of violence, where individuals are disconnected and the process they experience doesn't allow them to learn to sit with that discomfort of the shame. Nathanson, who sadly died 12 months ago, but I've worked with, as a fairly eminent American psychiatrist, wrote a book called Shame and Pride. He developed what is called the compass of shame. Now, what's particular about my approach to all of this is that, as you know, I don't tell anyone anything, but I ask questions that allow them to work it out for themselves.
Yeah.
So a really simple example of what Nathanson developed, which was this compass of shame, in which he argues when we're not able to deal with our shame honestly, we resort to what he calls 4 polar responses, a compass of shame, and which is our way of managing that awful feeling to make it go away. And in 2000, when, as a cop, I facilitated a conference for a murder involving a young 17-year-old called Michael Marsden. The documentary is called Facing the Demons. I got lots of emails in response to it. One from a young woman, and we'll call her Joan, who had experienced sexual abuse from the ages of 9 through 13, and disclosed at 26 and was further isolated from the family. She wrote to me and said, I want one of those meetings. Cut long story short, I ended up meeting with her, and I asked her 2 questions. I said, Joan, what does a good day look like? And she said, I couldn't describe a good day. I said, tell me more. Said, every time I begin to feel good about myself, my history kicks in, which is the ultimate shame statement. I said, what does a bad day look like? She said, every day when I wake up, I feel distress, anguish, suicidal, angry, depressed, and she named all the emotions. And she said, but the worst of all is that heavy feeling of shame and humiliation. I said, Joan, how do you deal with your shame and humiliation? And she said, I withdraw. I'm into big time avoidance. I attack myself, or I attack others. What she described was a compass of shame. So I went through and said, what do you mean by withdrawal? She said, I isolate myself. I don't want to be seen by anyone. I said, and avoidance. She said, drug and alcohol. I said, tell me more about that. She said, I'm in AA and Al-Anon and whatever else. I've been in psych wards, and she said, it's the only way I can medicate to sort of get to a different headspace. I said, attacking yourself. Yeah, look, I feel like I'm a loser and attacking others. She said, I just lose it on play. What I had with me was an A4 diagram titled The Compass of Shame, in which the 4 points of the compass, the withdrawal, avoidance, attack self, attack others, were on on this single sheet, and I handed it to Joan, and her reaction was to look at it, and then the tears came, and then she started to sob. And she said, do you mean I'm normal? And I said, I couldn't say that, but sure as hell, Nathan didn't think you were normal. I said, it took him 10 years to develop this, and took you 15 seconds to work it out. In other words, the point that I'm making is, as a basic proposition that underpins everything I do, that I think is universal, is to discover what it is that's keeping us out of relationships. That is, what's the impediment? The impediment is the affect of shame. And then it raises the question, what do I need to do as a practitioner that creates the conditions that allow individuals to learn to sit with the discomfort of their vulnerability and be open to learning, to a whole new experience. So let me just finish this little segment by saying, look, when you get to understand, as Nathanson, Sylvan Tompkins says, is the trigger for all aggression and anger and violence has to do with shame, and look, over the years, over the history, it's fascinating when you look at the medieval times where the learned response to shame and culturally was very different. When you get to the early 20th century, when you get Freud, who says that the fundamental problem with the world is our inability to deal with the sexual suppression and all the rest of it. And when you look at the technological changes, one that's really significant was when we moved from the lantern to the electric light. It had a profound impact on intimacy. And then if you look at the 20s and the bathing suits and you look at them now, so there's a whole different shift in terms of how culturally we nuance and deal with the affect of shame. Now, the fundamental problem we're facing as a society is that we're increasingly seeing more and more gratuitous violence. And it's to do with, at a time when there's never been more connections, we've never been more disconnected. And our ability to modulate those horrible feelings of shame are increasingly limited. That's why if you follow, for example, road rage, or where young people go and massacre their classmates, they'll always refer to a precipitating incident in which shame and humiliation was evident. Now, how does this all help? Well,
So, Terry, before we go into how that all helps, can I just, because I've loved listening to you unpack this, and it's just, I have many experiences of you drawing out in great detail, but I want to offer a little bit of a summary for the listeners, and then I want to come back to that question of how it all helps. So is it fair to say, and pick me up and correct me where I'm not getting this quite right, but that we can understand the violence that we see as a fairly normal response to an inability to manage an experience of shame? And when I say normal, I mean it's like you talked about it being hardwired, an affective response, but it's normal, but it's not helpful as a response for maintaining relationships and connection. So if we're looking to prevent or respond to violence, what we need to pay attention to is the way that people build connections and how violence can interrupt that. Is that a good summary of what you've been telling us just then?
Mate, I think it is, and you've done well. You've paid attention on this occasion, so well done.
Appreciate that.
but no, it's interesting you say that, because the theme in all of this is that, and if I give an example of how this has come together, the assumption we make around violence is that individuals are aware of what's happening for them.
Okay, tell us more about that.
And well, the difficulty is that my experience of being a cop and dealing with at all times vulnerable people, many of whom simply are struggling with the meaning of life, to suggest that in a rational way they have an awareness of what's happening for them, they're able to make choices, and they've made a choice, notwithstanding the potential consequences, that they're prepared to live with is just, doesn't reflect my experience. In fact, when I was a young cop and really good looking, I know you don't believe that, but that's okay.
It's like, all right, mate, because this is a podcast, we can just take your word for it.
Yeah, that's right. And I tell some terrible lies, but I had an encounter with what was called a dance hall, in which a young 14-year-old, we'll call him Gary, was in a fight, and I came up behind him, his brothers, and I grabbed hold of him from behind, just held him, and I whispered in his ear, "Settle down, we can work this out. What's your name?" He said, "Gary." So I said, "Gary, I'm going to take you out of the hall, so just cooperate with me and we'll work this out." He began to relax, and I got him outside the hall, and the 4 young people came out. And as I let him go and I looked back to sort of beckon them to stop, and I looked, and as my gaze turned back to Gary, he threw a punch and hit me fair in the right eye and knocked me to the ground. In fact, I could still feel my eye closing up. I grabbed him again, and I had a senior cop with me who went to handcuff him. And I said, "No, don't handcuff him." At that point, my colleague said to me, "This kid has been charged twice previously with assault, and he's on a good behaviour bond. And on this occasion, he'll go to juvenile detention for a minimum of 12 months. And it struck me that then, even though I was in this difficult dilemma, it struck me that what we did then didn't work. So I took the decision that I wasn't going to charge him at that point, that I needed to have a conversation with him and his mother, because I was wondering what in the hell was triggering the sort of violent behaviour. So 3 o'clock the following afternoon, in a 2-man police station, a little police station, had 3 chairs. In came Mum and young Gary, head down. Mum was very distressed, looked at me and burst into tears. She could see my eye, and we sat down, and the first question I asked her was, "Tell me about this young guy. Who is he?" She went on to describe he's one of 2 kids. She loves him dearly, and but he completely lost it in recent times. I said, "Tell me more about that." She said, "The only thing I put it down to was 14 months ago his dad was killed." At that point, Gary burst into tears. So the conversation that flowed from that was fascinating, because I was always of a view that Gary had no clue as to what was happening. And that proved to be correct. In fact, Gary had no capacity to deal with a whole raft of really painful emotions. And then what happened was, for the first time, Gary began to understand that it was his behaviour that was impacting on the very person he loved. 15 years later, so Gary's 29, in the same hall, I get a tug on my shirt. I turn around, here's Gary. He said, "Do you remember me?" I said, "I remember you, you little so-and-so." And we had a conversation. I said to him, he said to me, "I still can't understand how you let me off even though I had punched you." And I said, "What's happened for you since?" He said, I never got into trouble again after that. I'm happily married, I've got 2 kids, and life's good. Ben, I've probably been unpacking that experience since 1973.
I've heard you tell the story a few times, but it's good to hear it again.
Yeah, but what it said to me was that that my best contribution in all of this, and I held very firmly the view that I'm not the expert in any of this. Those that I reach out to are, and that what I need to do is to understand that their inability to deal with their vulnerability, their shame, has landed them in this position, and that my best contribution is to create the conditions that allow four things to happen. One is for them to make sense of meaning of what's happening for them. Second thing, to work out what matters. Third thing is to then think about what needs to change and what their part will be in that. And the fourth thing is to help them to work out how to build and sustain healthy relationships. And the difference between where I was in 1973 and where I am now is I understand the importance of what I call explicit practice. Most practitioners are really good at describing the what they do, but have very little insight in terms of the why. They're not explicit. It doesn't mean that what they do doesn't work. Being explicit means, as you're aware, we share the language, the practice, and the rationale for what we do with those who we're working with. For example, working with a young person like Gary, I'd help Gary to actually arrive at a point where he understands that what's happening for him is pretty normal. And that he better understands that, his struggle is really about being able to sit with the discomfort and connecting to himself. See, the story with anything I've ever done is about a whole lot of individuals who are disconnected at a number of levels from themselves, from those that matter, and from the broader community. And
Terry, I wonder if there's something really interesting that you've said in there, and I love this idea that you talk about regularly, which is understanding not just what we do, but why we do it, why it works. And there's one idea that you've mentioned that I'm hoping you could expand on just a little bit for us, which is this idea that some of these people who are doing this, having this experience of shame, don't understand what's happening for them. And so for me, that speaks to, well, you said it's not just about choice. It's not just about there being bad people making bad choices, but actually there's something bigger going on there. And I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit more in terms of how we can think about this issue of violence and this issue of, probably more specifically in this conversation, managing shame well, has to do with more than just an individual. It's something about the community. It's about connection. It's about something bigger than, like we said, just those bad people making bad choices. Can you speak to that just a little bit more for us?
Yeah, look, again, it goes back to the sort of foundational thinking, which is part of the why. And I earlier mentioned the idea of developing a set of working assumptions. So part of that is to think about why it is I do the work, what motivates me, what my beliefs are, in the primacy of relationships, et cetera, what my experience has told me. In other words, the idea that those who, are highly vulnerable and don't have an opportunity to deal with that vulnerability in helpful ways will never gain insight. And so part of the thinking around that is that rather than describe, what they're doing and look at the symptomology, my interest is more about helping individuals to really understand where they're at and how they landed. So how their story has got them to the point they have. Now, I often hear that, young people are victims of their own life experience. Well, it's true, but I wouldn't volunteer that. I want them to understand how they get to work that out, but they have to have a good insight in terms of, the fundamentals of human motivation, the importance of feeling loved and belonging, and how that goes some way to helping them to better understand themselves. But it's hard to begin thinking that I'm going to help a young person if, regardless of what I've got to offer, they feel a sense of disconnected from themselves. They don't feel that they're worthy of loving and belonging. So basically, my approach is at all times is to imagine that this young person has landed in a space where they're not sure how they got there, they're not sure where they're at, and they even have less idea about where they want to go. So in many respects, I'm a critic of a lot of practices that use programs, that attempt to build resilience and, all of those sort of coping strategies, when fundamentally there's a big bit missing in terms of what I call the foundational thinking that's needed to help young people or anyone understand how they've got to that space and what's really happening for them. And if they get a better sense of self, they're much better able to manage the other relationships.
So would it be fair to say that a big part of your work, but whether it be with individuals like you're describing who don't understand how they've got to where they are, or whether it's working with practitioners who are designing these programs, is an educative process? You're filling some of the gaps that lack in our relationships or in our culture, where we're not knowing how to deal with shame or build positive relationships, and that's part of your work is to help people have a framework to really understand what's happening there.
You raise an interesting point because our standard response is to educate, to inform, and many of your listeners here will find this interesting and affirming and all of that, but the bit missing is the experience. So 2 weeks ago I was in Singapore working with a whole range of professionals who do with divorce, family separation, family violence, and I said to them that what I wanted to do is to create an experience rather than for them to see this as a training. And I began with breaking them into groups and asked them about what motivates them to do the work they do, why they choose to do it, which is part of the motivation, what it is they find most satisfying, what are the challenges, and then what they actually they think they bring to the work. Now, once you picture the scene, I had them in groups of 3, mainly because three's a crowd in a sense of when you have an intimate sort of conversation. At the end of it, my interest was more about what the experience was like, as opposed to what they actually talked about. And the answer was, it was a great experience. What did you learn? Well, we got to better understand one another. I said, okay, and what else? And what made that process so affirming? And what were the strong emotions in play? So they talked about enjoyment, joy, interest, excitement, all of that stuff. And, they deepened their connection. I said, well, guess what? That's the experience I want you to replicate whenever you engage others. And the scaffold we used for you to get to that point is pretty much the same scaffold I actually want you to use when you're working with families who are estranged, who are stuck, who've got no capacity to process a raft of painful emotions because there are no rituals for that to happen. And I said to them, I want you to remember today not because it was a training, not because I taught you anything, but because you had an experience that gave you a sense of what it is you're trying to do or to replicate when you're engaging with families and kids. And the optimal word is engagement, which is emotional connections. So why I'm saying that is, look, I smiled when you said education, because part of the problem with how we disseminate information is we think it's all about, the sort of cognitive learning processes, when in fact it's all about emotionality and about how we connect at that level. And my argument is that it doesn't matter what the prevailing conditions are, what the issue is, or what the needs are. If we create the conditions in which individuals can connect at an emotional level, that they therefore are open to learning, growth, and connections.
Oh, okay. So maybe let me reframe a little bit of what I said before, and draw a connection back to the topic of this podcast in violence. So if we wanted to look at understanding violence, we see that as a product of an inability to manage the experiences that disconnect us from others, the affects, the emotions that disconnect us from others, and that if we want to go about addressing this issue, the ideal is to not simply educate people, not tell them and instruct them and create a framework for them, but actually to give them an experience of connection, give them an experience of the opposite, I suppose, to what they're currently experiencing, and say that through this experience you can be modelled, perhaps, of how to manage that emotion well, how to solve your problem, maybe for a lack of a better word, without violence. And you use the word ritual in there before as well, which I find quite interesting. So there's almost a need for, or there's a lack of rituals in our current society that tells us how to do these things well. Not just tells us, but gives us experiences of how to manage problems and manage emotions without violence. Is that fair? Is that a good summary?
Mate, I think it's a great summary. What it does, it says that regardless of what the context is, if we pay attention to how we engage others and we give them a voice, in other words, if I were to look at policing as a classic example, and what I discovered many years ago is that Tom Tyler in Chicago wrote a book called Why People Obey the Law. Fundamentally, he said it was about people being treated fairly and respectfully. The difficulty is that when you start to drill down what does fairly look like, and you ask someone to think of an experience which I've treated unfairly, what was needed that would have made it a fair experience, the answers they give just happen to reflect the three principles that a Harvard article, Chang and Mayborn, said, which was, being given a voice, understanding the reasons why decisions are made, and what I call expectation clarity. If I were to take those and say, look, I'm very explicit about that in terms of what I attempt when I engage anyone, which is to give them a voice in a way where they feel genuinely heard. So it's not just about having a say, an understanding of what's happening. So the idea of actually me saying, look, I'm not the expert, you're the expert. I'm not sure how I can help, but I'm really keen to explore that. I'm desperate to understand your story, and I work on the basis that if you're the expert, my role is to help you to work it out, to work out what matters, so you can work out the things that you can change in your life might get you to a space that is a better one than your one you're in. And I even say, if our time together works, is positive, what space do you think you'll be in? What would that look like? What would you leave with? So in other words,
What I hear in the last little bit of what you're saying is this connection that you started with in many ways, which is the why of what we do, and then the what it is we're actually practicing. And you've taken us through almost full circle now, I think, the theory that we start with about where violence comes from, and how we can understand that as a product of an experience that we can't necessarily make sense of. And just back around to this idea of the solution that we need is an engaging experience that teaches us through doing of something different. And that as practitioners, our job is to create those spaces and not necessarily to control them, but rather to give the people in that experience a chance to be heard and to express their experience and their emotion as a way to learn something new, to have a different experience.
Yeah, look, if I were to briefly go back to where I sort of formally started developing what became known as restorative justice processes, and it was in a place called Wagga Wagga, where I was put in charge of a group of young cops. What isn't known about the Wagga experience was that, sure, we did some pretty impressive work. We reduced the number of offenders before the court over a 2-year period by 70%, so significant outcomes, et cetera, et cetera. But I developed a conference script that was sort of picked up, throughout the world. But more importantly, the process I used to take the cops on that journey was one of engagement, of using the same sort of process that we're using with victims and offenders as a way of challenging cops to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. Now, if I fast forward that, what I did is I took the conference script and I uplifted the questions that I developed, which were at the core of the conference script. I put them on little cards, so business-sized cards. On one side it says, when things go wrong, and I asked a series of questions, and when someone's been hurt, a different series of questions. Let me just go to my recent visit in England, where I was working with Derbyshire Police.
Great.
It was a unique opportunity. I actually sat with operational cops as they were in the business of doing their daily chores. In other words, they go out, do a job, come back in, and I grab them for 15 to 20 minutes. And I sat with them and I said, look, I'm really interested in your story, your policing story. Tell me about why you joined policing, what's your motivation, what you find interesting, what you find challenging, what you struggle with. And give me an example. And give me an example of a matter you more recently dealt with. Well, they all cite an example of dealing with one or more juveniles. and they've got what is called an RJ process, the restorative justice process. Well, the history goes back to 1995 when I was on a, or 1994 when I was on a Churchill Fellowship. I landed in England and did a presentation to police in Thames Valley that ultimately I came back 12 months later and worked with them over a 3-year period where they were at the forefront of developing restorative justice process. So what I saw in Derbyshire was the evolution of restorative, so it became institutionalised and it lost the essence of anything that I'd ever offered it. In other words, that's what happens, because unless you understand the institutional arrangements, you wonder how it does happen. But at any rate, let me get back. The simple story was then saying to the cops, can you step me through what happened? And let me give you a simple example of one of the stories. 4 young guys assaulted another 14-year-old at a high school. The victim's mum was very concerned that the school wasn't taking it seriously, contacted police. Police got involved and they did an RJ. Okay, and what did the RJ look like? Well, this constable described, he went to each of the addresses and he spoke with each of the young person with 1 or 2 parents. He then went and met with the victim and the victim's mother. He spoke with them. They decided the matter could be dealt with by RJ, and the victim agreed to that, with the mother. And the constable then gave them a bollocking. In other words, there was no thought of bringing them together, and that each of the offenders was dealt with in their own homes with their own parents. And I asked to describe what the narrative was. What did you actually say? He said, well, I pointed out that this sort of behaviour won't be tolerated. If they continue to do that, the consequences are going to be very severe. They won't be given the same opportunity, et cetera, et cetera. And I said at the end of it, okay, what impact do you think you had? Who do you think was most significant in the life of that young person? And of course, no surprise, each of the police officers said, well, it was a stern warning that I gave them that was going to have the greatest influence. I said, is that right? And I said, and what's that built on? Well, fear of consequences. What do you mean by consequences? Or going to prison or being further punished? And then I said, so who, in fact, given the parent was there, who, in fact, do you think really had the greatest influence on the child? I said, well, I did with those parents where the parents had attitude, and I suppose the parents where they were supportive. Then I said, do you have kids? And this young officer said, yeah. I said, how old's your eldest? 12. I said, picture the scene where I'm you and I delivered the same broadside to you as a parent and to your kid. What would that be like? It wouldn't be very good. I said, and if I said that I'm the one who would have the greatest influence, what would you think about that? I said, oh, no, I would as a parent. Then I said to them, look, can we just rewind? And I want you to actually look at this little card. And on this one side, it says, when things go wrong. If you actually had approached each of the young people and said, what happened? What were you thinking at the time? What have you thought about? Who's been affected in what way? How would that have changed the conversation? And each of them said, well, I would have done less talking. And I said, and then you turned the card over and said to the parent, what did you think when you heard that young Ben was involved? What impacts this had? What's the hardest thing for you? and then said to them, what do you think it would have been like for the young person involved? And if that young person, I'm talking about the victim, and if that young victim were here now, what would you want them to know about what you've thought about since? Now, here's the point. I said, if we were in the business of being cops who wanted to build relationships, but importantly saw ourselves as facilitators in that community, we would have brought the 4 young people and their families together. We would have brought the victim and the families together. Okay? We would have created a space in which they could get to learn how to actually model process. Oh, by the way, I gave each of the constables 6 of these little cards. And then I said, so why have I given you extra cards? And one guy said, so we can give it to the parent. Why would you want to give it to the parent? So they could continue to model the same behaviour. And I said to them, what's the issue? Well, the issue is, for us, is how do we assure the victims? I said, what do you mean assure them? Well, the fear of crime and all the rest of it. I said, how could you assure them around anything? Why don't you actually just imagine that your best contribution is to engage them in a way where they can begin to deal with the raft of painful emotions? What did you think when your house was broken into? What impacts this had? What's hard for you? I said, who noticed you pull up with the police car at the front? I said, the neighbours. Well, do you think the neighbours know about what's happening? Yeah. So what would their take on it be? Oh, they'd be fearful too. Okay. What would happen if we got them all together and said, okay, let's talk about what happened and what you thought or what you realised, what had happened, what impact it had, what's hard. How do we build community out of these? I said, rather than you having to come back, assure victims, which isn't worth anything anyhow, because they work it out. You're a finite resource. Does that make sense, Ben?
Yeah, it does. And I really appreciate the example, because one of the things I really enjoy about your style and the story you just told us is that your medium is your message. So you took the police officers through their experience, but you gave them an experience as well of the Socratic process of understanding their own role within it. So there's kind of this double layer there where you're showing people how to work with issues like violence by giving them an experience of working with difficult issues like violence. And that's, I think, just an incredible example of what you've been talking about the whole time. So thank you for that. That makes a lot of sense. We're coming to the end of our time, and I've asked you to recommend a couple of resources for people who are interested in what we've had to say and want to follow it up a little bit further. And I've got them here, but I'm wondering whether you can tell us a little bit about what people should pay attention to as they look at these and read these resources. Because sometimes, for example, the first resource we've got is your latest book chapter, which is called "The Best Is Yet to Come: Unlocking the True Potential of Restorative Practice," which you can find in the Routledge International Handbook of Restorative Justice. If you wanted to reinforce one message that they'll find in that resource, what would it be?
Oh, it's the importance of understanding the why of what you do. The why of what you do is critical in terms of making the what purposeful. And I guess that leads to the next resource, which is Michael Jr., Know Your Why. A fascinating video. If you ever need convincing about the importance of the why, watch this guy for 4 minutes. It'll bring a tear to your eye. I mean, it's just a great story it's not a story, it's just a live happening where he asks this guy to sing. The other one is the idea of Hilary Cotton, who's based in the UK. It's my experience of systems where she cites the example of Ellen having 74 agencies hanging off the family, intergenerational. Nothing changes. In other words, if you're not sure what you're doing, if you're not sure where you're going, if you're not sure why you're doing it, you're never going to make a difference. It's as simple as that. And the other one, and that's a TED talk, and so is the other one, Know Your Why.
Perfect. It will provide links to each of those.
I also think I managed to send you a copy of Managing Shame, Preventing Violence, which is the companion document to a DVD by Nathanson, that you can make available without any issue. It's just the narrative of the DVD.
That's perfect. There you go. Bonus resource, not just 3 but 4, always going above and beyond. So appreciate that. Thank you, Terry. Look, that's excellent, mate. I always appreciate our conversations, and I'm really just thankful for the time you've given us. So yeah, look, that's excellent, and those resources will be really worth following up. As I said, I'll put links to each of those in the show notes, so they'll be there for people to access. Thanks again, mate. And look, I just can't wait for another opportunity to talk with you and hear about what you're up to.
All good, and I wish everyone listening to it all the very best. And if you take anything out of it, know your why.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, mate. Links to the resources discussed in the podcast are provided in the show notes. If you like the podcast, please share it widely. My name is Ben Lohmeyer, and thank you for listening to Exploring Violence and Society.